So why do I need an architect?
Okay, well, this is a really good question. It's the one that we're getting quite often. And I would say that having a professional on your project can make a huge difference in terms of the quality, cost efficiency, and general project management. So as architects, we have to go through quite a long training. So it takes us 5 years in the university where we have a different subject that we have to tackle, like building physics, contract law, and technology and design. So it's not just design aspects that we are learning. And then obviously we've got 2 years in practical side. So we have to do 2 years in practice before we can actually set the examination, which is quite challenging as well. So it is quite a long process to get us to the point, and the knowledge we gain during that process is really valuable, and we can pass that over to our clients and to the projects we are doing. So that's one aspect of it. Obviously, when we are in a training and then in our professional life, we have a code of conduct, which is ARB or RIBA, that we have to follow. So this ascertains our client that we act with honesty and we are not biased. So it's not like you are buying a service from the supplier who's trying to sell you a product. It is unbiased advice that you will get from your architect. So if you are unsure, about the product or about the design, we can certainly, look at it and give you our honest opinion on that aspect. The other thing to consider in terms of the profession, we do have to have a PI insurance. So you're kind of eliminating the risks if something goes wrong with the design. So the company, the architects that's going to have that insurance, if something goes wrong, you can always have the fallback on that, and you can make a claim based on that. So if something goes wrong with the design, you've got that extra risk assurance.
And how does that compare to somebody offering like architectural services?
So, well, the first thing you would want to ask that person is, are they covered by PI insurance? And the level of that cover is quite important as well. Obviously, the training is going to be slightly lower, I would expect, if it's just a designer and they didn't complete the full architectural studies. And again, if they're not covered with the PI insurance, if something goes wrong, it all falls down to you, so it's going to cost you money.
So how does a client check that an architect's following the ARB code of conduct?
So the first thing to do would be go on ARB website and check whether the person who calls themselves architects is actually registered. Because if they're not visible in that website or on a kind of register, they can't call themselves architects. So you've got the ARB as well. You can basically, if your architect is negligent, and I give you an example because I think that's probably the easiest thing to understand. If you come to your architect and you said you've got a set amount of money and ask them to do a design to that budget, and after a month of design work, the architect comes back and he's designed, or he or she designs something that is twice the budget, and you spend money on the architectural fees asking him to be designing to that particular budget, you can actually make a claim based on that. Obviously, this is kind of, a simplified version of how that would work, but you can contact ARB, make a complaint, and that's going to start the process, and you can potentially claim some of the professional fees back. So we don't have actually much experience of that in ACA. We haven't been challenged to that. So because of the quality of work we provide to our clients, and again, looking at ARB code of conduct, you need to be sensitive in terms of the client's budget, and you need to work to that. So we do quite often have clients that will come to us and say they already have designs and say, oh my God, I can't afford this. My architect has designed this, and it's just, it's unviable for me to do. So please be aware, of initial kind of conversation with an architect to disclose the budget you have. Not for your architect to spend all the money, but for your architect to have a framework to work to, but also, how that relationship's, developing. So obviously there are situations like, you can't control the economy. We are living in quite peculiar times, energy crisis, and we don't know what's going to happen with the economy. So that can obviously affect the budgeting, but it's unlikely to happen within a month. But if you were starting a design, say 2 years ago, and your architect was designing to your budget at that time, today the price could actually double. So there's two aspects to it to watch out. So obviously you've got a fallback on ARB, but it needs to be justified. It couldn't be 2 years later you're making a claim and actually because what happened in the world the prices has changed.
Yeah. And what if I was a client and I got carried away with the design, and that obviously adds area and adds costs, how's that best managed by the architect?
So again, when you speak to your architect, the first thing they would be asking you, what is your budget? Because that's, like I explained, this is the framework we would be designing to. So we would be then guiding you throughout the process. So if you during that design process say, I thought, I want that living room to be much larger. At that point, I would be guiding you and say like, yes, we can obviously accommodate your requirements, but that will increase your budget cost. So this is where the architect will tell you, look, of course we can do this because you are our client, but it will cost extra effectively. So you have to, as a client, take at that point the responsibility for decisions you are making.
Okay, so all of that sounds expensive. All of that training, all of that professional overseeing of the project. Is it expensive for an architect?
Is it expensive to have an architect?
Yes.
Well, it depends how you look at it, because there's other aspects that the architect, will bring to the project. So there's some basic services that the architect will provide. So obviously you're paying for an expert design and creativity. So your architect can transform your vision into something that is functional and aesthetically pleasing. He or she can maximize the space within your home, the light and the flow in the kind of ways you could have not thought. And there's other aspects that, as architects we would be doing, which I will elaborate probably later, but to blindly answer is, the architect can provide you generally a cost saving throughout the whole lifespan of the project that will be much less than your actual architectural fees. So just to give you an example, the architectural fees are governed by, again, RIBA provides a guidance on the architect's fees to be between 8 to 10% of your project cost. This is for one-off home. Basically, if that cost varies, obviously the percentage goes lower or higher. At ACA, we don't do it that way. We do it in a kind of resource and time lump sum fee basis, but this is the guidance for RIBA in terms of the percentage cost. We had recently a situation that the client didn't have a full production package that architect will provide within that fee proposal, and the price difference for what the contractor wanted to build and what the architect will specify was around £120,000. So 8 to 10% of the construction cost, or if there's mistakes on site, if there's stuff on a design that has not been thought through, for instance, later on during the design process, the architects would provide you with a production information package where that there's a detailed technical information on setting out, how the different materials, connect on site, where is the ducting going through. So all of that is coordinated by the architect. So, if you go on site without that information, without that architectural input, it's quite easy to run into quite high bill very quickly if you just go in with your contractors, on site. But again, part of it is, start from the beginning with your architect. So good design can actually save you money in the long run in terms of the optimizing construction method. So if you come to your architect and you have a set mind on certain construction methods, the architect can design with that construction method in mind, providing you a cost saving already from the start. Or even if you take it, a few steps backwards, we quite often get engaged even before you purchase the plot by doing like a little feasibility study on that plot. It's the risks, kind of like any kind of pitfalls associated with buying a plot that is maybe unsuitable for building. So again, the sooner you speak to the architect, the bigger saving you can probably achieve.
You mentioned about costs for an architect and working to a percentage of construction cost. Would you advise against that? Because typically, would the architect have any incentive to save you money?
So this is an interesting question, and the way we would do our costing in ICA would be based on lump sum basis, on stage by stage basis. So what we would do, we would basically calculate the time it would spend us and resources and present it to our clients as a lump sum, because as you say, the percentage of the construction cost can vary. It can go higher or lower. So if you are engaging your architect and you're asking them to help you with your budgeting, there is a risk that they're gonna get costing from the suppliers and it's going to be higher than what you could expect from other suppliers. So we had that scenario actually quite recently, as an example, with an extension project in Edinburgh, that we had a client who came from from that kind of background, and it was faced with a quite high architectural fees for the costing that, once reviewed, could be quite lower because he was doing a self-build.
So would you always advise to get your architect on some kind of fixed fee?
I would say yes, definitely. But obviously there are architectural companies that would be honest and acting with integrity. There's no question about that. So, but I think from my personal experience, I would say all the way, if you can secure lump sum fees on your project for professional services or construction method, main contractors and all of that, I would say all the way, go for that.
Okay, and you talked about breaking architect services into initial design, brief, planning, detailed design. Would you get fixed fees for each of those stages, and when you commit to an architect, would you commit to that full fee?
Yes. So you don't want to just bits and drops to be partially lump sum and partially, based on a percentage basis. I guess the deviation from that would be, when your project is potentially in more sort of challenging area in terms of the planning, and some aspects of project are really unknown at the beginning of the, when your architect is quoting for a fee. So there may be something within exclusions to that extent for the architect to cover the time that is, unknown at that point. The examples may be, you're building in a conservation area, or your building is listed, or you're building a house which is an area of natural beauty. So there are aspects there that may be within exclusions. And again, if you, for example, decide to change the brief in the middle of the design process, and you decide, you want much larger house, obviously that's going to require much more time by the architect to spend on the design. So even if there's a lump sum, then there's a communication to the client at that point. Yes, we have agreed the brief at the beginning. This brief has now changed, so by default we're going to have to spend more time on it and more resources. So that lump sum fee is obviously secured to a degree, but it is quite tangible and logical and easy to understand.
So it's better to be clear with your brief from the outset. And if you want to look at multiple options, build them into the fixed fee?
Yes, so the brief development is quite an important part. So we quite often get the question of when do I speak to an architect? As early as you can, even if you're not sure about what your budget is supposed to be. We quite often would advise you on what are current construction costs, and we can guide you through that process of defining that brief, help you drafting what are the must-haves within a design, within that budget, what are your wishes and desires. So we help you create that brief, and then we both agree that's the finalized brief, and from that point onwards we can start the design process.
Okay. So when you commit to an architect and you commit to that brief and that initial design, are you just committing to that stage? Like, do you have to take that architect on for the planning stage and then detailed design?
So I'm not going to speak for all of the architects, I can speak for ACA. But the way we do it in ACA is we would present you a fee proposal on stage-by-stage basis. So just to take you through the stages, you've got your initial design stage, then the next stage would be submission to planning, then you have the third stage, which would be showing the compliance with the building regulations, and the last stage in terms of the architectural package is providing a technical information for the contractors to work from on site. So you don't, if you're engaging ACA, you don't have to commit through all the stages, you'll commit just to one stage at the time, and we always ask you whether you're ready to progress to the next stage. Things may happen in life, and you may decide you can't really progress further. So we trying to accommodate as much of the flexibility within that fee proposal and the service we offer as we can.
And planning can take a bit of time as well, can't it?
Exactly, and the planning part is actually the most contentious part of any project. So although we are looking into planning policy and guiding you through that process as well, as to what would be allowable to be built. So again, you are de-risking there, creating a design that will fail, and then you're gonna have to spend more money on redesign work. It's really within the hands of the planning case officer quite often who are interpreting the policies exactly to how they see fit. So every project is different. There are some circumstances that there's more reassurance from the planning, but we always say that obviously if you can't get planning, your project will not happen. So this is the kind of key and most contentious stage in every project.
So the way AC Architects fee is structured, that actually works in your favour if you do get planning rejected, because then you're not committed to
exactly.
the full fee.
You're not committing. You're not signing the contract for a full fee. So at that point, obviously, we don't have many projects that has failed that way. So we always guide our clients to design something that will obviously meet their requirements, but also be compliant with the local planning policies. So we're not in a situation that your planning is being refused.
Okay, that's good to know.
Okay.
So you talked about an architect, bringing in an architect who's qualified can save you costs and efficiencies. Can you explain a little bit more about how that works?
Okay, so basically, well, it starts with a good design. So your architect can provide a good design that can basically maximize the materials used, maximize the construction method. So there's not a lot of wastage. The same will work for external materials, specification of that materials. So they perhaps allow maintenance, so you don't spend a lot of money in future trying to maintain it. So your architect can help you specifying those. And again, energy efficiency, it's one of the key aspects in today's crisis. And yes, building a low energy build, certainly we can guide you throughout those aspects and help you with specification for your home to be low energy, to zero energy or passive, should you wish to go down that route. So that's, at the design stage, but during this, the construction works on site, the architect would provide you with obviously the production information packages that show all the details to the contractors, So there's no ambiguity on site, and the contractor doesn't go away and does something which is either not in accordance with the current building regulations and laws, or it can cause you and issues in terms of the actual issues on site, like potentially, a clashes between whether you have MVHR installed, whether somebody has actually looked through the design and coordinated that information with a plumbing pipe work, so there's no clashes and you don't suddenly have to spend money on rectifying those on site. So you should have packages from your architect that avoid exact those situations.
And there are different efficiencies that work for different construction methods, so like modern methods of construction.
Yeah.
And would you advise getting an architect on board that's familiar with those construction methods? Like, are they just general knowledge? Do people know them? Architects know them?
I think that's an interesting question. But I think if you've got an architect who is familiar with a certain construction method, he will be able to make that design much more efficient from the beginning. Where the architect who's just learning, he's going to have to spend more time familiarizing themselves. He may not account for certain things, that the person who already have worked with the material know. So certainly I would say go for the person who's got an experience in it.
If you use a qualified architect, how does that help you gain compliance?
That's the part of the basic service we would provide. So if you, for example, if you're starting with that architect, this architect would be designing to the current building regulations from the start. So already at the initial design stages, the building should show compliance with the building regulations. Again, the planning would be similar, because we would be checking the planning policies and making sure that the design fits within those policies. And then the next stage would be that we would apply for a planning permission on your behalf and for a building control approval and so on. So it's a kind of two-stage thing. There are examples that sometimes you already have a design, and what we can provide at that point, we can provide a review of the building regulations. You would be surprised how many people do not carry the building regulations checks in the initial design stages. So yes, we do have clients that come in with the ready designs to us, and we do, that's the first kind of thing that we would review. We would review if the building is compliant with the building regulations. So it's quite important to have that checks done on the initial design stages, because what can happen is that if the architect haven't included that portion in, and say didn't allow enough of the depth within the floor zone, or enough depth within the roof zone, then your building height may have to increase, which can impact your planning approval, and you would be faced with extra fees going back to planning, trying to get a retrospective planning approval to accommodate those changes stemming from the technical design stage.
And are there any other permits that your architect would advise you of that would be maybe site-specific, like ecological reports, like that, surveys? Is that something an architect should advise of?
So yes, generally your architect would project coordinate. So that's another aspect, that would aid, your cost efficiencies in the long run. So we would be advising you from the start, looking at the site, what surveys or what reports will be required. At the basic level, each site should have a topographical survey, so the architect would coordinate obtaining quotes for those reports and, and guiding you throughout the process. So obviously, if there's any protected trees on site, there's going to be a tree survey that is required. If the building is in the conservation area, again, there may be archaeological surveys that may be required. So all of that, the architect will advise and coordinate on your behalf. So again, that's another aspect that the architect would take, is coordinating all the different consultants. So you've got, your third-party consultants like tree surveyors, topographical surveyors, site investigation, and then engineers, structural engineers you will need for your projects, civil engineers for your drainage. So we would all coordinate that and on your behalf, and you don't have to worry about it. So yeah.
And are these surveys site-specific?
They are, yes. You can't have topographical survey from one site and implement it to another. Just in brief, the topographical surveys will pick up all the kind of land contours, all the kind of external features, trees as well, any fences. So quite often, without that survey, if you just have like a basic OS map from your seller, that's quite often not enough because the OS survey can be a meter off really in sizes. So if you are building in the kind of constrained areas, it's really important to have that topographical survey done so you know exactly where your boundaries are and how much room do you have for your development.
So a lot of these surveys sound expensive for a client.
Mm-hmm.
Would you advise before you purchase a plot to get a feasibility study done with an architect to make sure you've considered all of these costs and site constraints?
Yes, and this is something that takes us to the beginning of when would you actually want to speak to your architect. I would say engage with the architect as soon as you locate the plot, because they can review that plot and provide that feasibility study and outline what is likely to be required. So you're already engaging in what sort of additional costs or what overall costs you can foresee on a project. Obviously, it's not going to be a site investigation. We're not going to be digging into the ground at that point, telling you what sort of foundation you can have. You can do that, of course, but site investigation is quite expensive. So it's a balancing act at that point. So we can give you an initial advice on what surveys will be required and give you an idea of the cost of those surveys at that point as well.
And if these feasibility studies fail and it's not feasible to get what you want on the site, what risk do you have then purchasing the plot?
So we always advise to make a point of saying, purchasing the plot subject to a planning approval,
Okay.
Because that process should cover all the kind of surveys already. So I think, if you are really a risk-averse person, it would be a key to get engaged with the architect even before you purchase the site, and they can help you. I'm not going to say negotiating the deal because that's for a solicitor to do, but certainly can help outlining you what the land will require to get you to that planning approval process and that planning permission you're going to try to achieve on the land.
Okay. And then that can be conditioned into the sale.
Exactly, you can certainly use that and then take the negotiations further from that point onwards.
And then you've got peace of mind you're purchasing a plot that you're ultimately going to be able to build it.
Yes, yeah.
So considering everything you've said and the advice on appointing a qualified architect, what kind of value can that add to the property?
Well, a good designed by a well-designed home by the architect can increase the higher resale value. So also, if you're considering the aspect of energy efficiency, the architect will guide you through that process and make sure the building is low energy. I would go as far, if you are building, if you're starting the build process specifically in Scotland with a passive house equivalent behind the corner in 3 years' time, and let's give a scenario in here. If you are building two houses, two different owners next to each other, the same house design, and one is building to the current building regulations and the other one is building to the passive house standard, in 3 years' time, because that guy who has built to the passive house standard level has a certificate, he basically, if you're going to try to sell that properties at the same time, the person who hasn't certified it's going to lose money at that point, because if you imagine yourself, okay, well, I've got a passive house certified, there's only 3 years difference between the two, so the house is not that much older than the other one. It's exactly the same, but it's got much better performance and I'm not going to have to pay a lot of bills on it.
Yes.
So which one you would go for?
Okay. And would you always advise getting a passive house designer involved early on to consider that in the design? I mean, can any house be passive?
It's it's a twofold question. I would say that if you are looking to design a passive house, you certainly want a passive house consultant to be involved from the beginning, because they're going to be taking into consideration your site, the construction methods from the beginning. They're going to be using the tools that are specifically designed to help achieving the passive house standard. Whilst if you already have a design, that may be a little bit more difficult and not necessarily get you to the point of the certification, because the aspects of the site perhaps weren't considered to the extent that it would be required for a passive house. I think the key here would be, getting a passive house consultant on board. And what we do in ACA actually, I'm a little biased because I'm a passive house designer, but I'm also an architect. And what we do in ACA, I'm overseeing all the design work that goes out from the practice. So we're already implementing that kind of knowledge from the start on our designs, whether you're aiming for a passive house certification or whether you just want a low energy home. So there's already a kind of thought within that design from the beginning.
Okay, so considering all of that and everything we've talked about, why would you use AC Architects?
Well, because of that reason, because of exactly that reasons. We, apart from all the kind of service that we would provide and help, we provide our clients with the guidance throughout the whole stages of the project. We give them the checklist. So obviously as a client, you also have certain decisions to make, certain obligations. So we help you with all of that to make the process as smooth as possible. We have done over 500 projects in the UK, and we have provide a comprehensive service to our clients. So apart from the architectural service, we also have a structural engineering company. We provide a principal designer role, which is to do with the health and safety regulations you are by law obliged to have. And obviously passive house certification service as well, should you wish to go down that route. And we are very good. We are very good, very passionate at what we do, and our clients' requirements are really the key to the relationship. We try to build the trust, and we want to design to our clients' requirements, and we will design to the point that you are absolutely happy with the design and feel excited about the process.
And would it be best to use an architect that's well versed in self-build?
Well, that's a completely entirely new subject, and we could be sitting here for another hour, but the self-build is quite different to a traditional build. So yes, we work with different partners, and just to break it down, your self-build could be, you could be managing the contractors on site, or you could be potentially, you could opt for having a main contractor or project manager to do your self-build. So there's different layers to the self-build project. And we have worked with all of those procurement methods. So we are very familiar in providing the information that is required for each of these routes. And ascertaining your process goes smoothly, your project goes smoothly. But yeah, there's certainly a difference between a traditional approach to the project and the self-build. And the self-build is, I want to say, it's like an animal in itself. And it's really popular in Europe. So yeah, where my background is. So yes, you building houses that are for generations. In Europe, and that kind of came into England, and it's evolving, which is quite nice to see.